There is a place on Earth where nothing lives, where the cold does not forgive, and where mistakes are never forgotten. At the start of the 20th century, the South Pole wasn't just a point on a map. It was the last symbol of global dominance. Whoever reached it first would prove something, not just about exploration, but about their nation itself. For Norway, a young country barely standing on its own, this was a chance to announce its arrival to the world. Precision, efficiency, and survival would define who they were. For Britain, however, the world's greatest empire, the pole was a matter of honor. It was about courage, endurance, and proving that tradition still mattered in a rapidly changing world. Two expeditions set out towards the same destination across the most hostile environment on Earth. By the early 20th century, the South Pole was the last great geographic prize on Earth. Every continent had been crossed, mapped, or claimed, except Antarctica's frozen interior. Antarctica itself was unlike any environment humans had ever attempted to conquer. Temperatures routinely dropped below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds could exceed hurricane strength. There was no wildlife to hunt inland, no settlements, and no possibility of rescue. Once an expedition committed, success or failure would be determined entirely by preparation and decision-making. By 1910, two men set their sights on the pole. Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian veteran, and Robert Falcon Scott, a British naval officer. Amundsen had one obsession: reaching the pole first and returning alive. He was not interested in heroics, public spectacle, or unnecessary science. His background was steeped in Arctic survival, particularly through studying indigenous Inuit techniques. He believed polar travel should be quiet, efficient, and ruthless in its logic. Robert Falcon Scott, by contrast, embodied the British exploration tradition. He believed expeditions should combine national pride, scientific discovery, and personal bravery. Scott wanted to reach the pole, but he also wanted to collect geological samples, conduct research, and uphold the image of British endurance under hardship. Their personalities reflected this divide. Amundsen was secretive, pragmatic, and flexible, whereas Scott was formal, idealistic, and deeply conscious of legacy. Amundsen initially concealed his South Pole plans, even misleading some supporters into believing he was headed for the Arctic. Scott, meanwhile, announced his intentions openly, confident in British resources and tradition. Polar exploration was still spoken of in the language of science and discovery, not competition. But beneath the formal statements, both men understood the reality. There could only be one first. Scott believed he was leading Britain's primary South Pole expedition, but he didn't initially expect direct competition for the pole itself. His planning reflected this assumption, focused on achievement and legacy rather than speed alone. Amundsen, however, knew exactly what he was doing. After learning that the North Pole had likely been reached, he quietly redirected his ambitions south. He informed his crew only after setting sail and notified Scott with a brief message once his expedition was already en route. This was no longer a solitary quest into the unknown. It was a direct challenge. From that moment on, every decision carried added weight. Distance, timing, supply placement, and speed were no longer abstract planning concerns. They were competitive advantages. Neither man would ever openly admit racing the other, but both understood the truth. The race had begun long before the first step south in their preparation. To prepare, Amundsen's planning bordered on obsession. He selected lightweight sledges, prioritized calorie-dense diets, and relied almost exclusively on dog teams. He practiced relentlessly on skis, ensuring every man could move efficiently across the snow. Even clothing was optimized for warmth, breathability, and minimal weight. Scott's preparation was broader. His expedition relied on a mix of methods: motor sledges, ponies, dogs, and man-hauling. The motor sledges failed early. The ponies struggled in extreme cold and soft snow. Dogs were underutilized due to Scott's skepticism and lack of experience. Amundsen established his base at the Bay of Whales, closer to the pole than Scott's camp at Cape Evans. This alone shaved crucial miles off the journey. Scott's team questioned the safety of Amundsen's location, but Amundsen trusted his judgment and experience on unstable ice. From the beginning, Amundsen ran multiple depot lane journeys, catching food and fuel with precise navigation markers. He overprepared these supply lines, ensuring redundancy. His men memorized distances, landmarks, and fallback plans. Scott's depot lane was less precise and suffered from weather delays and logistical strain. One key depot was placed farther north than originally planned, a decision we'll get to later. These early choices did not attract attention at the time. The race had begun quietly, but its trajectory was already diverging. Amundsen departed for the pole in October 1911 with a small, streamlined team. They traveled quickly and methodically, following a strict daily routine. Dogs pulled sledges efficiently, allowing men to conserve energy and maintain morale. Amundsen made difficult but calculated decisions, including culling weaker dogs to feed both the remaining teams and the men themselves. The team discovered a new route through the transatlantic mountains, later named the Axel Heiberg Glacier. It was steep and dangerous, but Amundsen adapted quickly. He adjusted loads and pacing without hesitation. Amundsen's expedition worked because it avoided crisis rather than overcoming it. Scott's journey south unfolded very differently. Equipment failures forced his team to man-haul sledges over vast distances, an exhausting and inefficient method. Weather conditions deteriorated earlier than expected, slowing progress and sapping strength. Scott adjusted team composition late in the journey, increasing the final polar party from 4 to 5 men. This strained rations and sledging capacity at the worst possible moment. Despite these challenges, Scott's men pressed on, driven by discipline and loyalty. After weeks of exhaustion, Scott's party finally saw the land flatten ahead of them. The horizon no longer rose or fell. There were no more ridges to climb, no more glaciers to cross. In every direction, the world looked the same. This is what the South Pole was supposed to feel like. Scott pressed forward, scanning the empty white distance. For a moment, there was nothing. No marker, no sign of human presence. The pole appeared untouched, silent, and waiting. Then something broke over the horizon. At first, it was only a dark shape against the snow, a vertical line, which was unnatural and out of place. And as the men drew closer, its meaning became impossible to ignore. A flag, not British, but Norwegian. Amundsen had been there first. Scott stood at the pole, not in triumph, but in realization. Months of planning, suffering, and endurance had led them to the exact center of the world, only to arrive second. The victory they had imagined was already over. Inside the tent left behind, Scott found proof, dates, measurements, and a letter confirming what the flag had already told them. Amundsen had reached the South Pole more than a month earlier. Scott recorded the moment in his journal with restraint, but the weight of it was unmistakable. This was not just disappointment, it was the collapse of a goal that had defined the expedition. The race was over, but the journey had really just begun. The journey north began immediately, but the men who turned away from the pole were not the same men who had marched toward it. They were thinner, weaker, and already behind schedule. At first, the return felt manageable. Familiar ground, known distances, but Antarctica does not care about familiarity. The cold deepened, the wind strengthened, and progress slowed to a crawl. Edgar Evans was the first to fall behind. Injured, disoriented, and exhausted, he struggled to keep pace. Not long after, he collapsed and died on the ice. The march continued, each step heavier than the last. Lawrence Oates knew he was becoming a liability. His feet were badly frostbitten. Every mile slowed the group further. As storms closed in and survival narrowed to a calculation of time and distance, Oates made his decision. One morning, he stepped out of the tent into a blizzard, leaving behind only a quiet sentence. "I am just going outside, and may be some time." He was never seen again. The remaining 3 men pressed on, now racing not for victory, but for survival. Fuel dwindled, and food ran low. Temperatures plunged far below anything they had planned for. Then the storms came. Pinned down by a relentless weather, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers found themselves trapped just 11 miles from a supply depot that could have saved them. Close enough to imagine, but too far out of reach. Unable to move forward, they remained in their tent as the Antarctic winter closed in. That was where they died. Months later, a search party found the tent half buried in snow. Inside were the bodies and Scott's journals. In them, Scott did not write of anger or blame. He wrote of responsibility, of the men who followed him, of the families who would grieve, of a world that would one day read his words. Those journals transformed the expedition. In Britain, Scott's failure became a story of noble sacrifice. His calm dignity in the face of death reshaped public memory. The expedition was no longer remembered for losing the race, but for enduring it. Amundsen, meanwhile, returned alive, successful, and largely misunderstood. His methods were efficient, unsentimental, and effective, yet to some they seemed cold, too focused on survival to feel heroic. Over time, history grew more honest. Amundsen did not succeed because he was lucky. He succeeded because he prepared for a reality rather than a reputation. Scott failed not for lack of courage, but because courage alone was not enough. The race to the South Pole left behind two legacies, one written in survival, the other in sacrifice. And together, they tell a harder truth. Antarctica does not reward intention, it rewards preparation. The race to the South Pole remains relevant because it mirrors modern challenges. In a place where nature offers no mercy, Antarctica revealed a truth that still applies today. The margin between success and disaster is often invisible until it is crossed. And that is the deadliest race in human history. The South Pole didn't reward courage. It rewarded preparation. Thank you guys so much for watching it to the end. It really means a lot to me. If you like stories like this, then make sure to subscribe, because there will be more coming out soon.